There are silences in life that are not empty. They are not absences of sound, but presences of something else entirely. They are architectural, filled with unspoken questions and feelings so heavy they seem to possess a physical weight, a gravity that can bend the space between two people. For months, the space between Julian and me was filled with such a silence. It lived in the sterile, refrigerated air of the data center where we worked, humming in the same low frequency as the servers that lined the halls in their endless, blinking rows. It was a silence built of exhaustion and quiet companionship, of shared midnight coffees, and the mutual understanding that the world of the night shift is a separate reality, a bubble where the normal rules of daytime existence are suspended. And in that bubble, in that humming, architectural silence, I had been holding my breath, waiting for a sound I was not sure I would ever hear. It began, as most significant shifts in the topography of a life do, as something ordinary. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days bled into one another under the relentless fluorescence of our windowless world, and the exhaustion was a physical entity, a blanket woven from lead threads. Julian had been quiet all shift, a muted version of his usual self. The easy energy that normally radiated from him, a low, warm hum that made the cold server rooms feel a little less desolate, had been turned down to a barely perceptible flicker. We were in the small, perpetually dim break room, sunk into the lumpy embrace of a faded green sofa that had likely been there since the building was commissioned. He had his coffee, I had mine. The only sounds were the distant drone of the server fans and the soft clink of his spoon against ceramic as he stirred a sugar packet into his cup, a ritual he performed with a meticulousness that I had come to find inexplicably endearing. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to carry with it the weight of the entire 12-hour shift. He set his mug down on the scarred coffee table and leaned his head back against the top of the sofa, his eyes closing. The harsh overhead light carved new shadows onto his face, highlighting the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes and the slight tension in his jaw. I watched him, as I often did, from behind the protective veil of my own quietness. I had become a scholar of Julian's moods, an expert in the subtle language of his posture, the minute shifts in his expression. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to love him from a safe distance, to map the coastlines of his life without ever daring to set foot on the shore. My camera, my actual profession outside of this soul-crushing night job, had taught me how to look, how to see the story in the fall of light on a subject. With Julian, I was always framing a photograph in my mind, capturing the fleeting moments of his existence that only I seemed to notice. "Mind if I just rest for a second?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. It was not really a question. Before I could even form a response, he had shifted, turning slightly toward me on the cramped sofa. He curled into himself, pulling his legs up, and then, with a final, boneless surrender to gravity, he let his head come to rest on my shoulder. The world stopped. The humming of the servers, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the very circulation of blood in my own veins, it all seemed to cease in that instant. His hair, soft and smelling faintly of the crisp, clean scent of his shampoo, brushed against my cheek. The solid, warm weight of his head settled against me, a profound and terrifying anchor in the sea of our shared silence. I sat there, rigid, a statue carved from pure, unadulterated panic. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming, a chorus of alarm bells and whispered hopes all ringing at once. This was the moment. The one I had both dreaded and yearned for in the deepest, most secret rooms of my heart. It was a line being crossed, not with a bold stride, but with a sleepy, unintentional stumble. And I, the quiet observer, was suddenly at the epicenter of the event. My role had shifted from photographer to subject, from watcher to participant. I could feel the rhythmic pulse of his breathing, a slow, steady tempo against my own frantic, staccato heartbeat. The fabric of his worn gray hoodie was rough beneath my cheek as I dared, ever so slightly, to tilt my own head. I catalogued every sensation. The pressure of his skull against my collarbone, the way a few stray strands of his hair tickled my neck, the subtle rise and fall of his chest that I could feel through my own. It was too much. It was not enough. It was everything. And in the humming silence of that break room, with Julian asleep on my shoulder, I finally understood that some boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but dams holding back a flood you never knew you were capable of containing. The first crack had just appeared. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer geological pressure of it, you have to understand the landscape that came before. Julian and I hadn't always been a study in shared silence and ambiguous intimacy. We had started as something much simpler, much safer. Coworkers. I took the job at the Tier 4 data center 2 years ago, a reluctant surrender to the practical need for a steady paycheck and health insurance that my freelance photography career could not consistently provide. It was meant to be temporary, a brief detour. But the nights have a way of swallowing time, and weeks turned into months, months into a kind of permanent twilight. The work itself was mind-numbingly simple for me. Walking the cold aisles, checking server statuses, swapping out failed drives, a ghost in the machine. It was a job that required presence, not engagement, which suited me perfectly. It allowed my mind to wander, to edit photos in my head, to live a life separate from the one my body was physically occupying. I first met Julian about 6 months into my tenure. He was a software engineer, one of the few who worked the night shift by choice, or so he claimed. He said he worked better without the distractions of the daytime office, the endless meetings and corporate chatter. Unlike me, who moved through the facility with the quiet efficiency of a shadow, Julian arrived like a small, contained weather system. He had a brightness about him, an easy smile that seemed out of place in our subterranean world of concrete and cable trays. He'd greet the security guards by name. He'd bring in donuts for the handful of us on the skeleton crew. He'd hum to himself while tapping away at a command line on a rolling crash cart. He was a spark of life in a place that felt like a mausoleum for information. Our friendship began in fragments, small exchanges over the coffee machine, brief conversations in the echoing server halls. He learned I was a photographer and asked to see my work, his interest genuine and refreshingly devoid of the polite, vacant praise I usually received from people who didn't understand the craft. He looked at my prints, stark, black and white landscapes, lonely city streets at dawn, and he saw what I was trying to say. He saw the quietness, the search for beauty in overlooked places. He didn't say, "Oh, that's nice," he said. "It feels like you're trying to capture the feeling of being the only person awake in the world." He saw me. And that was dangerous. It was during one of those early conversations, standing in the cold aisle between racks of servers whining like a swarm of metallic insects, that I felt the first, unwelcome flutter of something more than collegial affection. He was laughing at a stupid joke I'd made, a rare occurrence for me, and the sound of it bounced off the hard surfaces, warm and real. He threw his head back, and the harsh fluorescent light caught in his eyes, making them shine. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls I kept around my heart, the ones built from years of quiet observation and emotional self-containment, developed a hairline fracture. I saw him not just as a friendly coworker, a pleasant distraction from the monotony, but as a person, a whole universe of light and warmth and easy laughter that I wanted to get closer to, like a planet drawn into the orbit of a sun. I quickly looked away, my face growing hot, and focused on a blinking LED on a nearby server, pretending to check its status. The moment passed. He didn't notice, but I did. A switch had been flipped, and I knew, with a sinking, terrifying certainty, that I would never be able to flip it back. From then on, my nights were different. My awareness of him became a constant, low-level hum beneath my own thoughts. I learned the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the specific rhythm of his typing, the way he always smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon gum. Our friendship deepened, settling into a comfortable routine. We took our breaks together, complaining about our respective workloads, sharing stories about our lives outside these concrete walls. I learned about his family in Oregon, his passion for rock climbing, his long-term girlfriend, Sarah. He spoke of her with a casual, comfortable affection that felt like 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. I learned to smile and nod, to ask the right questions, to play the role of the supportive friend. It was a familiar part for me, one I had perfected over the years. The quiet, reliable friend. The good listener. The one who never asked for anything in return. I compartmentalized my feelings, packing them away into a small, locked box in the back of my mind. It was the only way to survive, the only way to keep him in my life. The friendship we had was a fragile, beautiful thing, a small, warm fire in the cold, sterile data center. I would not be the one to snuff it out by dousing it with the messy, complicated fuel of my own unrequited affection. And so I watched, and I listened, and I kept my secret locked away. I photographed him in my mind 100 times a night. Julian, frowning in concentration at a line of code. Julian, stretching, his shirt riding up to reveal a pale strip of skin at his lower back. Julian, smiling at something on his phone, a smile I knew was meant for Sarah. Each image was a perfect, painful little composition that I would develop and fix in the darkroom of my memory, prints that no one else would ever see. This was the foundation we were built on, his casual, open friendship and my quiet, secret love. A foundation that felt stable enough until the day the ground beneath him began to shake, and he reached for me not as a friend, but as an anchor. The shift was subtle at first, a gradual change in the atmospheric pressure between us. It began about 8 months before that fateful night on the break room couch. The catalyst was, as it so often is, a heartbreak. He and Sarah broke up. He didn't announce it with any grand drama. There was no tearful confession or angry tirade. Instead, the light in him just dimmed. The easy smiles became rare and forced. The humming stopped. He started coming into work looking hollowed out, as if someone had scooped out all the bright energy inside him and left only a tired, aching void. He moved through the nights like a ghost, his shoulders perpetually slumped, a permanent shadow of exhaustion under his eyes that even the harshest fluorescent lights couldn't erase. He never spoke about the breakup directly, not for weeks. He would just stare into his coffee cup during our breaks, a deep, furrowed line between his brows. I didn't push. Pushing wasn't my way. My way was to be still, to be present, to create a space of quiet stability that he could exist in without the need for performance or explanation. I just kept showing up. I made sure the coffee pot was full when I knew he was about to take his break. I'd mention a funny bug report or a ridiculous corporate email to try and coax a flicker of his old humor out. Sometimes it worked, and a ghost of a smile would touch his lips for a second, a pale imitation of the real thing, but it was enough. I was simply there, a constant point in his shifting, uncertain world. I was the server rack that never went down, the redundant power supply that could always be counted on. One night, we were in the break room, the silence between us heavier than usual. He hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, just slowly rotating his coffee mug in his hands. Then, without looking at me, he spoke, his voice low and rough. She said I was emotionally unavailable. He said the words as if they were a foreign language he was trying to translate, a diagnosis he didn't understand. She said I never let her in. Not really. He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide and lost, searching for something. Absolution, an explanation, maybe just a reflection of his own confusion. Am I like that, Liam? Am I closed off? The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. Me, the king of emotional containment, the architect of impenetrable inner fortresses. He was asking me for a map of his own heart, and I was a cartographer who had only ever charted my own desolate landscapes. I could have given him an easy platitude, a simple, no, of course not. But looking at the genuine pain in his eyes, the raw vulnerability, I knew he deserved more than that. He deserved the truth, or at least a version of it I could safely offer. I took a slow breath, choosing my words as carefully as I would choose a lens for a portrait. I began, my voice softer than I intended, that you're careful. I think you show people the parts of you that you think they want to see. The bright parts. The easy parts. I paused, watching his expression, seeing a flicker of recognition. And I think you're scared to show them the rest. The messy, tired, uncertain parts. Not because you're unavailable, but because you don't want to be a burden. He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze intense. It felt as though he were seeing me for the first time, not just as his quiet night shift buddy, but as someone who saw him. He didn't say anything. He just gave a single, slow nod and looked back down at his mug. But something had changed in that moment. A door that had been sealed shut between us had been cracked open, just a sliver. I had offered him a piece of unvarnished truth, and he hadn't run from it. He had accepted it. In his loneliness and confusion, he had let me see a part of him he kept hidden. And in doing so, he had unwittingly invited me to step just a little bit closer. The change had begun. He was starting to lean, and I was the only thing solid enough to lean on. It was from this new, fragile ground that the ritual was born. The ritual of the break room couch began as an accident, a singular event born of sheer exhaustion. But it soon morphed into something else entirely. It became a routine, an unspoken agreement, a third entity in our relationship that was both a source of profound comfort and excruciating tension. The second time it happened, a few nights after the first, it felt more deliberate. Julian walked into the break room looking like he'd been dragged through the 7 circles of hell. He mumbled a greeting, poured a coffee he didn't drink, and then just stood there, swaying slightly on his feet. He looked at the lumpy green sofa. Then he looked at me, already settled in my usual corner. A question flickered in his eyes, one he didn't seem to have the energy to voice. I understood. I shifted over, pressing myself against the armrest, creating a space for him. It was a silent invitation, and he took it without a word. He sank down beside me, letting out a groan as his body relaxed into the cushions. For a few minutes, we sat in the familiar silence, a foot of space between us. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt anything but accidental, he leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder again. This time, I was prepared. My body didn't seize up in panic. Instead, a slow, warm wave of something I could only describe as terrified joy washed over me. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull away, to laugh it off as a joke, to say something that would shatter the fragile intensity of the moment. But he didn't. He just closed his eyes and breathed. And so it became our thing, our ritual. Every shift, at some point between the 3rd and 4th hour, when the caffeine had worn off and the profound, soul-deep loneliness of the deep night began to set in, we would retreat to the break room. He would settle next to me, and he would sleep. Sometimes he'd talk for a bit first, his voice growing slower and softer until it trailed off into silence, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. Other times, he would just collapse beside me, already halfway to unconsciousness. I became his sanctuary, his human pillow, the one place in his turbulent life where he could simply shut down and be still. I lived for those 30-minute intervals. They were the most terrifying and beautiful parts of my day. My senses became hyper-attuned to him. I learned the exact weight of his head, the way it would grow heavier as he fell into a deeper sleep. I learned the pattern of his breathing, how it would start shallow and quicken slightly in a dream, then settle into a long, slow rhythm of true rest. I could feel the warmth of his body seeping through his clothes and into mine, a localized heat that seemed to spread through my entire being. I would sit there, perfectly still, my own muscles aching with the effort of not moving, my mind a chaotic symphony of warring thoughts and emotions. Part of me was soaring. He chose me. He trusted me with his vulnerability in a way he had apparently never trusted anyone, not even Sarah. He let me see him when his armor was down, when he was just a tired, sad man seeking a moment of peace. The intimacy of it was intoxicating, a powerful drug that fed the starving creature of my affections. I would study the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the way his lips parted slightly as he breathed. I would sometimes, in moments of reckless bravery, allow my own head to rest gently against his, inhaling the scent of him, letting myself pretend, just for a moment, that this was not a strange ritual born of grief and exhaustion, but something real, something shared. But another part of me was in agony. The ambiguity was a form of exquisite torture. I was a safe harbor, a convenient comfort object. Was that all? I was terrified of reading too much into it, of letting my own desperate hope color the reality of the situation. He was hurting. He was lonely. He was just tired. I repeated these phrases to myself like a mantra, a litany to ward off the dangerous, seductive whispers of hope. To him, this might mean nothing more than a comfortable place to rest. For me, it was everything. Every touch was a question mark, every shared silence a sentence I couldn't translate. The line between friend and something more had been so thoroughly blurred it had ceased to exist, replaced by a vast, foggy territory where I was completely and utterly lost. The ritual escalated in small, almost imperceptible increments. One night, it was particularly cold in the building. He shivered in his sleep, a sudden, violent tremor that ran through his body and into mine. Without thinking, I found myself moving my arm, draping it tentatively over his shoulders, pulling him slightly closer. He responded in his sleep with a soft noise of contentment, nestling deeper against my side. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure it would wake him. My arm was on fire, every point of contact a brand. I left it there. After that, my arm around his shoulders became part of the ritual. Then came the day he nudged my hand with his as he was drifting off. My fingers were resting on the cushion between us, and his hand, limp with oncoming sleep, brushed against them. I froze. Was I supposed to take it? Was it an unconscious movement? After a moment of frantic internal debate, I slowly, carefully threaded my fingers through his. His hand was warm and surprisingly strong. He didn't pull away. His fingers curled loosely around mine, and we sat there, holding hands in the dim light of the break room, while he slept and I felt like I was going to disintegrate into a million pieces. This became the new normal, a quiet, domestic tableau that felt both deeply right and fundamentally impossible. We were two coworkers on a night shift, and yet, for 30 minutes at a time, we were something else entirely. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, caught in the beautiful, terrifying space between what was and what could be. The silence was no longer just architectural, it was alive. It was filled with the sound of his breathing, the feeling of his hand in mine, the weight of his head on my shoulder. It was the loudest silence I had ever known, and I was terrified that one day, one of us was finally going to break it. The night the silence finally broke, the world outside our concrete bunker was wrapped in a thick blanket of snow. The storm had started in the late afternoon and had intensified throughout the evening, turning our usual commute into a treacherous crawl. The data center felt even more isolated than usual, a hermetically sealed ship adrift in a sea of white. The storm seemed to have absorbed all the ambient noise of the city, leaving a profound, insulated quiet that amplified the hum of the servers and the soft whisper of the ventilation system. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Julian had been even more subdued than usual, the stress of the past few months seemingly coalescing with the oppressive quiet of the snowstorm. He looked frayed at the edges, his movements slow and deliberate. When our break time arrived, we went to the break room, as always. The ritual began in its familiar way. We sat on the couch. The space between us seemed to hum with a different kind of energy tonight, a tension that was sharper, more focused. He leaned against me, his head finding its place on my shoulder, but his eyes remained open, staring at the scarred surface of the coffee table. He was awake, fully awake. My heart began to beat a little faster. This was different. The pretense of sleep, the plausible deniability that had been our shield, was gone. This was just him, awake and choosing to be this close to me. My arm, as it always did now, was draped over his shoulders, and I could feel the subtle tension in his muscles. He wasn't relaxed. He was coiled, like a spring. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching and thinning until it was a fragile membrane, ready to tear. I focused on my breathing, trying to project an aura of calm I was nowhere near feeling. My mind was racing, trying to decipher this new variable in our complex equation. Finally, he shifted. He pushed himself up slightly, turning his head to look at me. His face was only inches from mine. I could see the faint flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight tremor in his lower lip. The air thickened, becoming heavy and difficult to draw into my lungs. The entire universe seemed to shrink, collapsing to the few inches of charged space that separated our faces. He looked at my eyes, then his gaze dropped to my mouth, and then back up again. The question was there, clear and terrifying in his expression. Liam. His voice was a whisper, barely a sound, yet it was deafening in the stillness of the room. I could only manage a choked sound in return. I cleared my throat. Yeah. My own voice was a stranger to me, rough and unsteady. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine, as if looking for permission or a warning. Can I ask you something weird? My blood turned to ice and fire all at once. My entire body felt like a live wire. This was it. The breaking point. The moment the dam would either hold or burst, flooding everything in its path. I gave a small, jerky nod, unable to form words. Would it be, he started, his voice cracking slightly. He swallowed, and tried again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, shimmering and impossibly fragile. It was the sound I had been waiting for, the one I never believed I would actually hear. It was a terrifying, beautiful sound. My mind went completely blank. Every fear, every hope, every carefully constructed defense I had built around my heart crumbled to dust in that instant. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of my feelings for him, a truth that was now reflected in his own vulnerable, questioning eyes. He was not asking for comfort. He was not acting out of confusion. He was asking for me. Time seemed to stretch, each second a lifetime of frantic thought. I could say no. I could protect myself, protect our friendship, retreat to the safety of the ambiguous silence we had inhabited for so long. I could tell him he was confused, that he was just lonely, that this was a mistake. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But as I looked at him, at the genuine, terrifying hope in his eyes, I knew that safety was no longer what I wanted. I had spent my entire life observing from a distance, protecting myself from the potential pain of engagement. But for him, I was willing to risk it. For this one chance, I was willing to risk everything. I took a shaky breath, and the single word I had kept locked away for so long finally escaped. Yes, the word was a mere puff of air, but it landed with the force of a tectonic shift. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to change my mind. I didn't. I met him halfway, closing the final, infinitesimal gap between us. His lips were soft, hesitant, and cool from the refrigerated air of the building. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a confession, a prayer whispered from one trembling soul to another. It was tentative and achingly gentle, a discovery of new territory. I could feel the tremor in his hand as he brought it up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. I lifted my own hand, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him just a fraction closer. The kiss deepened slightly, a mutual sigh of surrender passing between us. It tasted of coffee and uncertainty and a hope so fierce it burned. In that single, quiet moment, in the dim light of a break room surrounded by a snowstorm, the entire world was rewritten. The silence was not broken, it was transformed. It was now filled with a new, beautiful, terrifying answer. The aftermath of a moment you have waited years for is never what you imagine. In my daydreams, a first kiss with Julian would have been followed by a seamless transition into a new reality, a quiet, mutual understanding that would flow as naturally as water. The reality was a jagged, awkward silence, more frightening than any of the ones that had come before. As soon as our lips parted, the spell was broken. Terror flooded Julian's eyes, replacing the vulnerable hope that had been there just seconds before. He pulled back as if he'd been burned, his hand dropping from my face. The warmth was gone, replaced by a sudden, chilling cold. I'm sorry, he stammered, his gaze darting around the room, anywhere but at me. He scrambled off the couch, putting the coffee table between us like a barricade. I shouldn't have done that. I'm a mess. I don't know what I'm doing. The words tumbled out of him in a panicked rush, each one a small, sharp stone pelting the fragile new thing that had just been created between us. Before I could find my voice, Before I could say his name, before I could tell him it was okay, he was gone, fleeing the break room and leaving me alone on the couch, the ghost of his kiss still tingling on my lips. The silence he left behind was not architectural or full of unspoken meaning. It was just empty, a true and total void. The next week was one of the longest of my life. The ritual was dead. Julian avoided me with a painful, meticulous precision. He rescheduled his breaks, took different routes through the server halls, and kept his head down, buried in his work, whenever I was near. The warm, comfortable bubble we had built around our night shifts had popped, leaving behind only the cold, sterile reality of the data center. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of awkwardness and regret. He wouldn't meet my eye. When our paths did unavoidably cross, he would offer a tight, pained smile and a mumbled greeting before hurrying away. Each rejection was a fresh wound. My hope, which had soared to such dizzying heights, came crashing down. The internal monologue that had been filled with anxious yearning was now a relentless loop of self-recrimination. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. He was grieving and confused, and I had let him use me, had let myself be a temporary balm for his loneliness. The kiss hadn't been a confession, it had been a mistake. A moment of weakness he now deeply regretted. The thought was a bitter acid in my stomach. I felt used, but worse than that, I felt stupid. Stupid for believing, even for a moment, that the quiet language we had developed could have possibly meant the same thing to him as it did to me. The pain of his absence beside me on the couch was a physical ache, a phantom limb that constantly reminded me of what I had lost. I let it go on for 6 shifts. 6 nights of walking on eggshells, of feeling his avoidance like a brand. 6 nights of the empty break room couch mocking me. But by the 7th night, something in me shifted. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant throb, but it was being overshadowed by a rising tide of frustration. I was tired of the silence. I was tired of letting him dictate the narrative. What we had, what I thought we had, was worth more than being ghosted in the corridors of our workplace. The friendship alone was worth more than that. He didn't get to light a match and then run away from the fire, leaving me to burn alone. I had been the quiet observer for too long. It was time to say something. I found him in one of the coldest, most remote server aisles, a place we rarely had reason to go. The noise from the server fans was a deafening roar, a wall of white noise that ensured absolute privacy. He was standing in front of an open rack, staring blankly at the blinking lights, not actually working, just hiding. I walked up behind him and stood there for a moment, letting my presence register. He stiffened, his shoulders bunching up around his ears. He knew it was me. He didn't turn around. "Julian," I said, my voice coming out louder than I intended, barely carrying over the din. He closed his eyes, his posture a study in defeat. "Liam, please." "Not now." "Yes, now." I insisted, stepping closer, until I was standing beside him. "We have to. You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist." My voice was shaking, but it was steady. The frustration had burned away the fear. If it was a mistake, then fine. Tell me it was a mistake. But look at me and tell me. Stop hiding. He finally turned to face me, and the sight of him nearly broke my resolve. He looked shattered. The exhaustion was back, deeper than ever, and his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, cornered panic. He looked like a man drowning. It's not that simple," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Make it simple." I pressed, my own voice softening despite my anger. "Because this silence is killing me. I'd rather you tell me you hate me than have to endure this. Just talk to me." A sound tore from his throat, a choked sob of frustration. He leaned his head back against the cold metal of the server rack, his eyes squeezed shut. "I can't," he said, his voice cracking. "Liam, I can't. Because it wasn't a mistake. That's the problem." He opened his eyes, and they were swimming with unshed tears. "It was the only thing that's felt right in months. And that terrifies me." The confession hung in the roaring aisle, a fragile truth in a storm of noise. He pushed himself off the rack, his hands running through his hair in a gesture of pure desperation. "After Sarah, I just felt so empty, so lost. And you were just there? You were so quiet and calm, and you never asked for anything. You just let me be. And it felt so safe. He started pacing the narrow aisle, the words spilling out of him now. And that feeling, it started to change. I started needing it, needing to be near you. And I didn't understand it. I told myself it was just friendship, that I was just leaning on you. But that night on the couch, I knew it wasn't just that. I looked at you, and all I could think was that I wanted to kiss you. And when I did, it felt like coming home. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression raw with anguish. And that scared the hell out of me. What does that mean? Am I just rebounding? Am I using you to fill this hole inside me? It wouldn't be fair to you. I couldn't do that to you. You're the best friend I have. I couldn't risk ruining that, so I ran. I'm sorry, Liam. I'm so sorry. I'm just so lost. I listened to his torrent of words, and the anger and hurt inside me slowly dissolved, washed away by a profound wave of empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was protecting me. In his own confused, panicked way, he was trying to do the right thing. He was afraid of his own feelings, afraid they weren't real, afraid of hurting me. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who was terrified of breaking the one good thing he had left in his life. I closed the distance between us, stepping into his space until we were standing toe-to-toe in the roaring, cold aisle. You think you're the only one who's scared? I asked, my voice low and steady. He looked up, surprised. Julian, I have been in love with you for over a year. I have sat next to you on that couch every night, with your head on my shoulder, and I have been terrified. Terrified that you would wake up and realize what you were doing to me. Terrified that my feelings were so obvious you could see them written all over my face. Terrified of ruining the most important friendship I have ever had. I reached out and took his hand. It was ice cold. You're not using me. You can't use someone who is freely offering what you need. And you're not lost. You're just here. With me. I squeezed his hand. So stop running. Please. Just stay. Let's be scared and lost together. A single tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He looked down at our joined hands and then back up at my face. A small, watery, but genuine smile touched his lips for the first time in a week. Okay, he whispered. Okay, in the deafening hum of the servers, we had finally found a way to speak the same language. The conflict was over, and in its place, a new, tentative silence began to grow. One not of ambiguity or fear, but of mutual understanding. The conversation in the server aisle was not a magic fix. It did not instantly erase all the fear and uncertainty, but it was a foundation. It was a patch of solid ground on which we could start to build something new, something honest. We walked out of that roaring aisle and back into the main corridor, our hands still loosely clasped, a silent testament to the treaty we had just signed. We didn't talk much for the rest of the shift. We didn't need to. The most important things had already been said. What we needed now was to relearn how to simply be in the same space together, under the new terms of our shared truth. When our break came, there was a moment of hesitation. A silent question passed between us. I walked toward the break room, and after a second, he followed. I sat down on the couch, in my usual spot. He stood in the doorway, a flicker of the old panic in his eyes. I just looked at him, my expression calm, and patted the cushion beside me. It was an invitation, clear and free of pretense. He took a deep breath and walked over, sitting down next to me. The space between us felt different, still charged, but with a quiet hum of potential rather than the high-frequency anxiety of before. He didn't immediately lean against me. Instead, he just sat there, looking at his hands. I waited, giving him the space to make his own choice. After a minute, he turned to me. "Can I?" he started, his voice soft. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned over, resting his head on my shoulder. It was the same action, the same position, but the intention behind it had been fundamentally altered. It was no longer an act of unconscious comfort-seeking. It was a conscious choice, a statement. I am here. I want to be here. I rested my own head against his, and this time, there was no hesitation. I found his hand and laced my fingers through his. His grip was firm, certain. We sat there, not speaking, just breathing together, letting the new shape of our silence settle around us. It was peaceful. For the first time, it felt completely and utterly peaceful. In the weeks that followed, we built our new normal, brick by brick. The ritual on the couch continued, but it was transformed. It was now the anchor of our night, a deliberate moment of connection, a quiet affirmation. Sometimes we would talk, whispering about our day, our hopes, our fears. Other times we would just sit in comfortable silence, his head on my shoulder, our hands intertwined, drawing strength and warmth from each other. The plausible deniability was gone, replaced by a quiet, joyful intentionality. We started to build a life outside the data center's concrete walls. He came to my apartment, a small, light-filled space that smelled of darkroom chemicals and old books. He looked at the photos on my walls, the ones I had never shown anyone, the deeply personal ones. He saw the loneliness and the yearning in them, and he understood. He didn't just see my art, he saw me in it. I went to his place, a minimalist apartment that felt a little cold, a little empty. I brought over a plant. We cooked dinner together, a clumsy, laughing affair that ended with us eating slightly burned pasta on his living room floor. We were slowly, carefully, bleeding our two separate worlds into one. One Saturday, we drove out to the coast. I brought my camera. I spent the afternoon photographing him, not as the unknowing initiator or the object of my secret affection, but as Julian. Julian, laughing as the cold spray of the ocean hit his face. Julian, his expression thoughtful as he stared out at the horizon. Julian, looking back at me, his eyes full of a soft, steady warmth that made my breath catch in my throat. As the sun began to set, casting a golden, syrupy light over the world, I lowered my camera. He walked over to me, took the camera from my hands, and set it carefully on the sand. Then he framed my face with his hands and kissed me. It was nothing like our first kiss. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was sure and deep and full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. It tasted of salt and wind and the promise of a shared future. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The hollowed-out look in his eyes was replaced by a familiar light, brighter and more steady than before. The weight I had carried in my chest for so long, the burden of my secret, simply evaporated, leaving behind a lightness I had never known. We found our home not in a place, but in the space between us. It was a space built in the dead of night, in a sterile break room, under the hum of 1,000 servers. It was an unlikely architecture for a home, but it was ours. The sun would rise each morning as we left work, and for years, I had seen it as an ending, the end of the shift, the end of another lonely night. But now, walking out into the cool morning air with his hands securely in mine, the sunrise felt different. It was no longer an ending. It was a beginning. Every single day, it was a new and beautiful beginning.